Our next presenter is Nathan Mudyi Sentance. And I should say that we're extremely grateful to Nathan. We had a spot open up because Matt wasn't able to come, and Nathan at very, very late notice was able to step in. Nathan is a Wiradjuri librarian and museum practitioner who grew up on Darkinjung Country. He currently works at the Powerhouse Museum as head of collections First Nations, and writes about history, critical librarianship, and critical museology from a First Nations perspective. I can highly recommend Nathan's blog, The Archival Decolonist, but he's also published very widely in places like The Guardian, British Art Studies, Cordite Poetry, and the Sydney Review of Books. We're also very lucky to have Nathan at the University of Sydney for a short time, which is where I first came across Nathan's amazing work with the library, which continues to be set the standard, I think, within the university. So thank you very much for being here, Nathan, and over to you.
Yuruma Nindagi, Nathan Sen Shuanadi, Raji Give Paladu, Yindamalaja, Baramadagu, Mujikangu, Yindamalaja, Baramadagu, Nurumbangu, Yindamalaja, Nadi, Mujikangu. Before we begin, like our previous speakers, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Baramadagu people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and recognize no matter what happens on this land, no matter what we do, that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it's something that I try to take seriously in my day-to-day practice as a person who works in collections. I try to figure out how I can not just acknowledge country with my words, but with my actions, whether that be through some of the custodianship of the cultural belongings, the ancestral belongings that I get the privilege to take care of. As Nick said, I'm Nathan Mudyi Sentance. I'm a Wiradjuri man. I won't go too far into who I am, but I always think it is important to introduce myself so you kind of get an understanding of who I am. And I always think that's important because when I was studying to be a librarian, neutrality was actually pushed very much in the course to actually basically say librarians and libraries should be neutral, which is something that I disagree with. And so part of my sort of refutation of that is usually when I give a talk, I'll give a little info about who I am because I want to explain where I'm coming from and what influences me and why I have potentially the biases I have. And so, I'm a Wiradjuri man. My family is traditionally from Mudyi, New South Wales, but I grew up on Darkinjung Country on the New South Wales Central Coast. I'm a librarian by trade. My first ever sort of job in collections after the Darkinjung Local Aboriginal Land Council was at the State Library of New South Wales, working under Ronald Briggs and Melissa Jackson, who have been Indigenous librarians at the State Library since 1991. I'm very gracious that they got to be my mentors. And later, the State Library was joined by Dr. Kirsten Thorpe. But at my time at the State Library is actually where I sort of started questioning, collections, history. We used to get community come visit the collections. And Ronald and Melissa would always invite me along when community came. And I remember one day, really early on in my museum library's career, seeing an auntie read a record about herself. And the record was in a missionary's diary. And the missionary said, so-and-so broke her arm. And she was like, oh, I've never broken my arm in my life. I will take an x-ray today to prove it. And even though what was between the written record and Arnie's lived experiences, that discrepancy could be considered innocuous, it did make me think that this missionary's diary was in the State Library collection and Arnie's lived experience was not. And that the State Library of New South Wales is, considered the repository of New South Wales. It's where Thomas Keeley went to write Schiller's List. It's where people used to write history. And I was like, and Arnie's story is missing from that. So if you're basically building history without these lived experiences. And also from there, it also started making me think about, different sort of tensions I saw between community and collecting organizations. One of them being when we had this project called Rediscovering Indigenous Languages, where we digitized all our language material that we could find, and we worked to give it back to community. And so much, so much of the community were like, well, it's good that you're giving us copies, but this is actually our intellectual property. We'd actually like to have it. we'd like to control who gets access. And because of things like copyright restrictions and the State Library Act, we couldn't actually allow that to happen. And the other key tension I could see from that project too was also just, again, like the truth-telling aspect of like, the majority of it was written by non-Indigenous people, so it had a lot of misinterpretations. A lot of, the example I was always given was one of the anthropologists, a dictionary that derived from one of the anthropologists' work referred to stone as, say, gibi from a particular language group. And if you actually look at the anthropologist's diary, the reason why he thought gibi means stone was he saw a group of mob in a circle and they were passing a stone to each other and they were going gibi, 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 gibi. So he was like, well, that must mean rock. But obviously not taking in that there's something far more complex happening there. And a similar thing happens, just naturally. Like when I also worked at the Australian Museum, when a shield would come into our collection, because it looked like a shield that was held like this, it would just be given the delineation shield. Where in Wiradjuri, I know that there's at least 6 different words for shield, and one of them is gira, which means kind of like wind, which I don't quite know what that means, but I just know that must mean something much more complex than just something to defend yourself with. So they're the sort of things that sort of influence my sort of, collections practice. I'm not really a theorist. I only really have a bachelor's degree in library science. But these are sort of the thoughts that I try to figure out how to facilitate, going on Dr. Kirsten Thorpe's work, Indigenous collection sovereignty. And I guess this is a big part of it. Is like, this is by Emily McDaniel, who was actually the first First Nations director at the Powerhouse. Sadly, Emily's gone on to cooler projects at the moment, so we miss Emily. But she said this, like, collections who reflect the relationships we hold. And I think that's incredibly important because often museums, we actually are very things first. We actually always think about, we have this stuff, it's important to us, it should be important to you. Or in terms of with like Indigenous communities, we always think about like the object's preservation needs rather than what is actually the community's preservation needs that it comes from. Actually, how can this actually be an object of cultural resurgence, cultural maintenance, and which sometimes means that it might not be actually being held at the Powerhouse to actually facilitate that. And I guess a longer version of sort of what Emily was saying is, as I was saying, Dr. Kirsten Thorpe, who used to work at the State Library, is now at Jumbana at UTS, basically sort of said this in her thesis about Indigenous archival sovereignty, that it's centered in relationships and it's about collections being living. And as Jennifer sort of said before, not being sort of static, being sort of storerooms. And I guess, as I was saying, these sort of things are why, these are the sort of things I'm trying to address, I guess, in terms of collection sovereignty. So I guess possessive logic, as I was saying, is sort of like the ownership of collections. And this ownership can also take in many forms as well. Like, it can also even be an intellectual ownership. I've noticed when I was working with this Indigenous languages material, when I was thinking about it, out of the 200 objects that we digitized for that languages project, 199 of them were written by non-Indigenous people. And I always thought that in that scenario, if you wanted to cite that Indigenous knowledge, you would actually have to cite a non-Indigenous person as being the sort of owner of that knowledge, as some of the first people to sort of record in the Roman alphabet Aboriginal languages. And I always thought that was wrong. And these digital returns do not address ownership. I think it's something important because I guess digital repatriation is becoming a big deal, and I think it's really important. But it sometimes doesn't address sovereignty. Just even like the other week, we digitized some old oral audio-visual material from an old exhibition, and because it was from the 90s, we were able to reach out to some of the aunties that were taking part of that exhibition and said, would you like copies? And they said, oh, yes. And then we said, oh, is it cool if we keep the material? And they said, oh, yeah, we made it for an exhibition, keep it. But I remember one of the aunties was coming through town just at the right moment, like a couple of days later. So we were able to just give her a USB with some of the videos. and my colleagues were talking about it. They were like, Nathan's involved in this really good digital repatriation project. I was like, I gave one person a USB with material on it. It's cool. Like, it's necessary, but it's not this big thing. I think, and also too, like, how do we maintain this long term? I think is the important thing, because those aunties there basically said, yes, we would like it being in the collections at the moment, but how do we address if future generations, if future descendants feel differently? How can they withdraw consent? And I guess paternalistic ideology fits in that as well. Again, when I was doing that languages project, fellow librarians were always like, isn't it great that the State Library has this collection, because now that we, we can protect it, it means that Aboriginal communities now have it. And I always think like, yes, kind of. I truly believe that, first of all, the collection was not built with Aboriginal people in mind in the future. And secondly, I feel like it does stem from the same place. That's basically like Aboriginal people couldn't care for it if it wasn't at the State Library. And I think a good quote about this is Victor Stevenson, who does a lot of he did that book, Fire Country. He has a quote in it saying that Indigenous knowledge needs to live in Indigenous people, not databases. And I truly believe that is actually the best way to preserve material. And I guess I've talked about this a bit, addressing authority and not allowing dissensus. Museums historically have been, that's pretty much, we've sort of spoken from a place of authority, and that has had historical ramifications. The story I always tell from the Australian Museum was when I started there, I would do tours called Truth and Treaty tours. And part of it was I would talk about truth in museums. And so I guess the first story I would tell was basically when before I started at the Australian Museum, one April Fool's, the Australian Museum thought it would be funny to put a drop bear display in the lobby. And people walked past, and colleagues said they saw it and got their phone out, and people were going, I told you they were real. I told you that drop bears are real. And it's because whatever the Australian Museum put on as well, people will perceive as fact. And a less funny example of that is when I started at the Australian Museum, I went through the Australian Museum magazine from 1920 to 1960 to see what they wrote about Aboriginal people and about the exhibits. And one of the stories I read from 1921 that was written by, I think, anthropologist, I think his name was like Charles Headley or something from UC. He wrote in the Australian Museum magazine that grown Aboriginal men and women have the minds of small children. And so if you think about that, if you're a member of the general public and you're reading this gross, inaccurate information, but at the same time you're hearing that Aboriginal children are being taken from their parents, you probably think that's justified if you're reading from an expert organization saying that grown Aboriginal men and women have the minds of small children. So I guess that's the sort of reason why we need to have sort of dissensus and have different perspectives enter this, and to not like completely disregard the institution, but allow an interrogation of authority within it. And I guess a really important one is, not adhering to Indigenous people's right to keep their secret and sacred ritual knowledge private. Some of this stuff was been recorded and shouldn't be in the public domain. And I guess, again, we have to sort of figure it out. So we have sort of in the Powerhouse collection, we have photographs of ceremonies that, because they're out of copyright, are in the public domain, but it doesn't mean just because of that case that they should be. And we should need to work with community to make sure that we respect this right. So that's sort of what the Powerhouse team is working on. And of course, it's not just me. So we have Bo James, who's our associate director, Corey Webster, who's also known by the rapper named Nookie. He's a great rapper. Danita, who works in our Pacific programs team. So our First Nations remit is not just First Nations of this lands, but First Nations internationally as well. Madeline Pole, who her dad was sadly pulled out of today. Me, Tammy, who was a former dancer and an incredible collection coordinator, and Trey. And so that's the team. And I guess giving you a rundown of our collection. So out of all the collections I worked with, this is one of the more interesting First Nations collections. So I came from the Australian Museum, which has the second largest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collection in the world. Here, about 1,300 objects are made by First Nations people in the Powerhouse collection. But our remit's all this, so we actually care for what we call First Nations representations, which are photographs of mob, but also representations can be in the history of design. A lot of people painted mob on, plates, dishes. Mob are represented in lots of design. And then we also have what we deem as appropriations, which are like, that's more like, I guess, when the government uses a bark painting for a stamp without sort of talking to mob, or other people sort of use sort of Indigenous designs, but they're not Indigenous themselves. So we sort of, and collaborations is like when collaborations will happen with a lot of posters and stuff like that, like mob organizations would pay for someone else to make a poster, and it would be sort of a collaboration. And I guess this is the ways we're trying to address some of the collection sovereignty. So this is our database emu. Well, this is actually not a private record. I just put a sort of a notice on it to sort of give you an example of what it's like. So this gives you sort of an example. So in our database, we can kind of put like ISIP male handling only, and I'll sort of put this sort of flag up that warn people that this object is male handling only. And then from there, we'll also put it into the private storeroom that we have with sort of a marker on a storeroom, so staff won't go through it. And we also sort of put a flag which means ISIP, which basically is just, I guess, our copyright protocols, which basically says, this is ISIP, do not use or do not interpret without sort of coming to the First Nations team. And then what we do as the First Nations team is we'll usually reach out to the community, regardless of what it entails. So if it's like they want to use, this, for example, is a Daria Torres Strait Islander headdress. They wanted to use it for like, a publication or like even sort of some sort of newsletter or press. We'll usually try and reach out to some sort of representative from the community to see if that's okay. Because one of the things we're really about is Indigenous people having the right to self-determination in how they're interpreted, or being the primary interpreters of their cultural heritage. And this is another thing that we're doing, which is called the deed of deposit. So it is, we've only done 2, and basically it's things to being deposited to the Powerhouse collection for safekeeping in the long term, but the legal ownership never transfers over to the Powerhouse. So potentially we could have it in perpetuity, but if the community ever wants, they can take it back whenever they want. And the first example we did of this is with Arnie Gale Marbo. This is us sort of negotiating with Arnie Gale. So we have her father's shirts, Uncle Eddie Kopi Marbo. So we have 2 of his shirts, but it's really, this is actually kind of stems from her idea. So basically she wanted to donate them, but then when we gave her the donation form, she kind of had questions about them. And from that, we developed the deed of deposit. So yeah, the shirts are in our collection, but they're legally Arnie Gale's, and it also has protocols about if Arnie Gale was to pass, who would be the next person. So in the Marbo family, that would take the ownership. And as I was saying, I think it's really cool as a piece of accountability for us. If she doesn't like what we're doing, she can take the shirts back, or make sure that we continuously serve the community. Because at the moment, what's serving the community is us taking care of the shirt. But maybe in 30 years, they make a Marbo museum up like in Queensland or on Muir Island, and the best place for it would be there. So this would make the legalities of that too very easy. And also part of the things was also how they want the Powerhouse to care for them. So with the shirts, she basically said, I trust the Powerhouse's fashion conservators to do what they see fit. But if they have to do any repairs, just give us a notification of what they're doing. Whereas other sort of community, say with these, Larrakitch poles from sort of the Wannabe family, they basically said we would like them to sort of disintegrate over time. And they said conservation can fix them if it's man-made issues, like if we bump into it with a trolley and we break a bit apart, we can fix that. But if it's just the natural chipping or the natural expansion, to leave that. So there's some of the things that we're doing. And then this is a project I'm working on at the moment. Namu Wawan Dubulu, sorry. So this is working with Wawan traditional owners. They're hosting a gathering actually in a couple of weeks of Wawan elders and kids and family members So basically, we have these old photographs in our collection taken by Charles Carey of Wailwan ceremonies that he was going to use for postcards. In response to that, we basically wanted to ask them, should these be public or private? And if they're public, would you write the interpretation for them? And the community basically responded saying, yeah, we'll do that, but we also, one of the big issues we have with those photographs being out in the public is the fact that the way people talk about them is to talk about Wailwan culture as in the past. So now what they're doing is they're having these gatherings to use some cultural revitalization, which the Powerhouse is helping facilitate, and they're going to take a series of new images that will be licensed by the Powerhouse. And as part of that, we hire a non-Indigenous photographer to take the images, and they're going to sort of disrupt what Charles Carey sort of did in the past. They're going to share copyright with the photographic subject. So the subject and the photographer will own co-copyright, so they can't be used without the community sort of go ahead in the future. So that's basically it. I have this last slide, but this is actually because I modified some of this from my lecture I do for digital systems in museums. But you can mull on these questions as well if you want. And they could be sort of conversation starters. But Monday Guru, thank you.